Hello, this is Freethought. This is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Riv.
And I'm Joe Barnhart, and welcome. I want you to know if you do or don't believe in God, be with us. We're going to have a good conversation, and I hope you can participate. Don't be alone, be with us. And this is a program trying to discuss views without supernaturalism. Go.
Right, and I want to tell you a bit about the show's sponsors. It's the Atheist Society of Knoxville and National East Tennessee. We have weekly gatherings every Tuesdays. We're meeting now, actually, but it'll probably go for a couple more hours. At Flats and Taps here in Knoxville. Yeah. And meet up with camaraderie, conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselyte, provoke, or punch, please don't.
Don't do it.
Yeah. And later on in the show, oh, sorry, you got the.
Okay, where am I on this?
All right, right here.
It's later in the program, we'll give you our website for additional information for times and locations. And okay, we're on page 3 here.
All right.
Yeah. And 4. Yeah. And the opening now today is, what are we going to do today?
All right, well, a brief mention, just to be aware of that is coming up soon, is National Day of Prayer and National Day of Reason is coming up soon, so be aware of that. I'll probably talk about that in another program, probably.
Okay. Go ahead and finish this so we can get started in the program.
All right. And actually, that's
about it, huh?
Those are in the news segments, and on to what we're going to talk about.
Okay, we're sponsored by the ASK, the Atheist Society of Knoxville, and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. And now, our program is going to be, can we read or study the New Testament generously?
That's a loaded question.
Okay, and by generously, partly I think we mean fair-mindedly. And sometimes we use the word objectively. That's a very difficult term to define. I don't think it means neutrally, because neutral thinking is like driving in neutral. Right. You don't get anywhere. You just try to, if you're going to be objective, it seems you try to be inside a view that you're criticizing to get inside it, so you can understand it, and understand it from the viewpoint of the person who propagates it. Not what you interpret it to be, first of all, what he says or she says it is. And then you look at another view and another view, each one fair-mindedly. And then you do, and objectivity then is once you understand each view, then we try to do comparative analysis, see what we can come up with. Now, our topic today is what? The New Testament.
Yeah, the New Testament and being interpreted generously.
Okay.
So fair-mindedly.
And
something interesting that was mentioned, so easily we'll project what we think about something onto something, having no knowledge about it other than whatever our predisposition is.
That's a good point.
And it's easy to do that with notable books and pieces of literature throughout, or movies or anything. The Bible is a glaring example, I think, of that. But like you said, I think it's good to maybe, even within the context of everything that's written, try to get behind what they were trying to write when they were writing it.
Get the historical background in it. Matter of fact, I want to even emphasize, the Bible isn't just one book written by one person or a committee. It's a whole collection of literature over centuries. And a lot of the material that was not included in it was also written by these cultures. And so later on you had groups of people who selected some parts and rejected other parts. However, today we can read parts that were not selected. And find out why they were rejected and why kept.
There's 60-something books in total, 66
well, that's
or
what
more?
That's what they're called, Now, the important thing to read is that to understand this early Christianity was born in a culture that had already a Hebrew background and with some of its monotheism, somewhat. I want to emphasize that.
Right.
And then you had the Greeks and the Romans with their radical polytheism. And so Christianity lived in that culture and had to communicate in that culture. And for some of the background in the Hebrew tradition, you have incredible diversity. For example, I want to make a proposal and see what you think. That Hebrew monotheism probably began as polytheism. And then, for example, in Genesis it says, you have God presumably saying, let us make man. Well, who's us?
Yeah.
Well, when I was growing up, you had various...
Slip of the tongue there.
Well, was he talking to angels or talking to himself? And later on, some Christians read back into it, well, they was talking to the members of the Trinity. But that's not in the Hebrew Bible. So is it part of it? I think it's part of the polytheistic background, because the word God, Elohim, as I pointed out earlier on this program, the word Elohim is itself God, but it's plural.
Right. Is the most? I think the translation for Elohim was it God Most High, or was it?
Well, I had a translator. One Elohim, and El is another word for God, like Samuel, Ruel, Daniel. All of these names are using the name El, God. And then the Im put on Elohim is simply plural. And what I'm suggesting is that polytheism really developed first.
Right.
And it merged into a form of monotheism. But even in the Bible, you have, for example, in the book of Job, you have the sons of God coming up.
Right.
And one of them is called the adversary. And we pointed out in another program. That's translated in the King James translation in RSV as Satan. But footnotes point out it just means the adversary.
It's interesting you mentioned that, is because I've heard looked into some different interpretations as well, with the difference between Satan and Lucifer. And you had at the time the not entirely a kind take on the king of Babylon. So it's said that essentially the star, how you've fallen low, and so on, is referring to the king of Babylon.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. As a matter of fact, one of the big problems that the Hebrew writers were having, and also in Mesopotamia and the Syrians and so forth, is that if they had a god, then you got the problem of suffering and evil and disaster, and that includes in tornadoes that human beings don't usually invent themselves,
right,
and earthquakes. And so they had to come up with some notion of, the polytheists already had a view that the gods were at war with each other, and destruction.
That's just collateral damage.
And herein you have in the Hebrew Bible, the adversary comes up, and then in the book of Job, God's asking him, what have you been doing? What if God's omniscient? He'd already know.
Right.
And it's an interesting polytheistic background here, it seems to me.
And the concept of omniscience is, I think, interesting because if you mentioned the problem of evil, of course, you have the subset to the problem of man-made evil and the problems of natural evil. But when it comes down to things that we would do, often comes up, I think, very valid argument of, and actually, was Epicurus had the Epicurus had the line of, I don't paraphrase it the best, but essentially, if it's, if capable but not willing, if willing but capable, if all these things, like all God in the beginning. The quote is better read.
Well, sometimes they use the word natural evil and moral evil, to make it kind of
And then so the compromise seems to be, I've seen in recent theodicies, is, well, we're not saying omni, we're saying maximally, which kind of almost goes to the root of the question of, well, can God make a rock so heavy you can't lift it?
Yeah.
Well, no. So you're saying that he can't? Well, no, he could if he could, if he wanted to. But, so you fall into a trap there.
Well, Bob, the problem of omnipotence does raise all kinds of questions, as theologians realize. For example, I remember in theology school I went to for 3 years after college, and we really raised the question, because we had some real good questions. Okay, let's suppose there's a devil operating, doing a lot of evil. Why has he not been incarcerated?
Yeah.
Why keep him alive? Now, according to the book of Revelation, and we brought this up previously, he's going to be incarcerated someday. What's the big delay? You see, well, basically the problem was, the reason they had to have this adversary theory is there is so much harm in the world, and they couldn't say, well, the deity just can't control it all.
Right.
So they appointed a bad guy. But that's irresponsible. And that's what we were trying to show the teachers in the seminary, and the teachers understood this. That's why they got in trouble with some of the preachers, because the teachers understood the problem. And one teacher in another school I went to said that God simply is not omnipotent, can't control all of this.
Right.
And of course, a naturalistic view is that there is no supreme consciousness in the first place.
Right. No.
And that's the way that's another way of dealing with this.
It's always presumed that, well, you have to start with this. But if you don't start with this, then you can look at, you're not limited. You can try to find more of the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the time you get to the New Testament, you still got the problem of you have to have a moral world just to get along. Just as we pointed out, if you're going to drive in the highways, you have to have rules and regulations. If you're going to live with other people, we have to have guidelines. And so the problem is, where do these guidelines come from? Now, most of us hold is that today is that human beings evolved like animals, and animals had to develop rules and regulations. If you watch the dogs, they have to have some rules and regulations, and we do too.
Right. We were talking about that actually earlier. It was one that was mentioned, talking about Dennis Prager had a debate with Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
And, well, he made a video again in March. And, of course, Hitchens can't respond to it, but he repeated the same talking points, and that was essentially saying that without God, it doesn't matter all these good things or bad things. You need a God for objective morality, which kind of supposes that there ought to be one, rather than
that there is.
It presupposes just by asking the question, and and then so you look at societies all around the world, and be it religion, be it not, be it anything in between.
Yeah.
The more society grows, the more structure you need, and now it's interesting because we have so much technology, and life is so much more safer in a lot of ways. So the complacency creates kind of a scene that we're not as intimately and instinctually aware of how dangerous the raw and primal world actually is. So it gives kind of a false, false boosting of credulity whenever Prager would make those arguments. But if you strip away all the technology and strip away everything, you still were left with a society that, if they did anything they wanted to do at any given time, it would be utter chaos.
Yeah.
You need some kind of structure, with religion, without religion.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, even children discover this. If you're going to play a game, if it's going to be a game, it's going to have regulations. You have to have predictability and reliability and dependability. Otherwise, you cannot count on teammates, even your opponents. You have to count on your opponents not to do certain things.
Right.
You don't play football with brass knuckles.
Some would like to do that, though.
But if you do, they learn the hard way that the other team can do the same thing.
Right.
And that's probably why they have to do away with the rules. Have a rule against brass knuckles.
And on a slightly anachronistic point, they have the notion of comity, right, in the courts going back, and which I think might have helped to serve a purpose, but now it's gotten to the point to where, especially in the Senate and in the House and in the Parliament, people are trying to talk more and just talk about the issues rather than go through this notion of "I do declare" and so on. So So that's kind of going away while people are still trying to keep it on. Most notably, in the Congress with Elizabeth Warren, Mitch McConnell, that whole bit. But
okay, so I think what we're saying is that long before the Ten Commandments,
right.
so-called, people had to have and did develop their guidelines and their rules and their regulations. Otherwise, they would not have made it.
Right. You needed something, whatever you wanted to call it, you needed something in the interim to keep things stable, to get where we are now.
To have predictability. And if you're going to make progress, you have to have some order and structure in order to make progress.
Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting stories in the Bible is the story of the flood.
Yep.
And I've often talked to people who think abortion is wrong. I don't think of a fetus as a person, but I ask, okay, if God wiped out all of these people, were there any fetuses in the flood? Yeah.
Most undoubtedly.
Well, yeah. So you don't have biblical grounds to deal with this problem of the abortion. You've got to raise it. In other words, what I'm suggesting, and I think you would agree, to have ethics and morality, you have to have factual information to deal with. And then with that factual information, you compare it with other facts, and in that you develop regulations for what we want out of life. And then we discover some things we cannot have that we want because they interfere as a fact with other things we want.
Right.
So we learn that early.
Yeah, it's what's that old axiom that goes that, in some sense, someone's right to throw a punch ends when it hits another person or something.
Yeah.
And then, but so that seems pretty clear cut. As far as stating one action or one cause in one action, and in situations, it goes back to, I guess, talking about the generous interpretation, right?
Right.
Just kind of a thought. People are quick to point out, I think, that you'll have laws, you'll have scriptural laws, and that they say, well, God says this and God says that, therefore, now they'll be broken the next day, but it's okay because it was an exception. Now, I think there are problems all throughout, but I think that might be where sometimes people get the impression that, well, there's no problem with this, because they'd use the exact same example. They might say, well, of course you're right to throw a punch and someone hits me in the face, but in situations, what if I have to protect myself? Or what about if I have to do this, or what do I have to do that? So I think people juxtapose that into saying, well, it says that you shouldn't make graven images, but then they'll go and make graven images. But, well, no, it's okay. It's okay because exceptionary, and or the commanding of being of the killings and the Canaanites and so on and so on. It's an exception because God said so. So I think people tacitly imply they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of the discussions
rules sometimes, some rules kind of run into each other, and they have to modify them. according to the circumstances, and you find this just in riding bicycles.
Right.
Yeah. Now, we've mentioned in this program the Golden Rule, and I want to emphasize that's not just the New Testament, that's in the Old Testament, but that's every culture has had to develop this. Now, you can take a cynical view of it or another view of the Golden Rule. One view of the Golden Rule is doing to others as you would have them to do, and you is, well, I like strawberries and bananas, and so I give you strawberries and bananas, but what if you don't like strawberries and bananas, you see? Well, I don't think that's what most people understood the Golden Rule to mean.
Yeah.
It's pretty much a principle. You like to be respected and have your rights and your preferences shown respect, and do the same for the other person. And any culture that's going to survive for long is going to develop some kind of Golden Rule. Otherwise, it's not going to be a society. Would you agree on it?
I would agree, unless you have some. Even if people don't agree with it, if they don't, you have to have from I guess an anthropological point, past societies.
Yeah.
If you don't have some kind of agreement, then it's just going to be chaos.
Yeah.
Have some kind of system of accountability, some kind of system of that you could go to sleep at night with the relative confidence you'll wake up.
That you'll wake up, yeah.
Yeah. You don't have that.
We take all that for granted, but how much of society is trusting other people. And we learn to do that by growing up with people we can trust and then letting the circle get bigger and bigger. And when you find people who can't be trusted, trying to incorporate them to help them to be more trustworthy. And that's why we have, that's why the public school system is good in some respects. You have people from different walks of life coming together, learning to harmonize and respect each other, even on the playground.
I think, a side note, France has a really nice system with that. A lot of the public schools, it doesn't matter, income level, it doesn't matter. You just put in the same school. And so you'll form a different kind of view of people growing up.
Sure you do, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And
they're practical.
Yeah, well, you learn from each other, and so you don't feel so alienated. Okay.
Right.
So now let's look, for example, in the development in the New Testament. You have a mixture of good common sense developing, and at that time, mythology. Mm-hmm. Now that's the best they had at that time. Now what do we mean by mythology? It's a mixture of stories they invented and stories they told to try to make sense of the world, but it's long before anything comparable in modern science. That's long before Galileo and Copernicus even,
right,
or even Newton, to say nothing of contemporary physics and biology.
Right.
And so the New Testament was born in the first century in a pre-scientific day, but they had people who were rational and could communicate and had what would be called common sense. And then they would learn how to live with each other. And then they invented and would spin out all kinds of views, and many of those views are about gods and angels and sons of God and that sort of thing, that many people today don't take to be quite believable. And so we have to respect those people doing the best they could, and we're doing the best we can with what we have in our time. Now, you had an atomic theory even in say, 3 BC at least, but it's nothing like atomic theory and subatomic theory.
Right. I mean, you look at evolution alone. I mean, in the last 50 years, we've learned so much more than everything before. We had the Human Genome Project.
Oh yeah,
that revealed a lot. Mm-hmm. We're understanding more and more, which contribute directly to some medicine we have, and ways to, because of our increased understanding of biology now, we can trace things back, and we can look forward, look behind, look forward, And we have, I was just reading about it the other day, we have, using with bees, right? So, we've now been able to effectively take out HIV.
Oh yeah.
In even some mice and some other creatures. And now we have a system of essentially repairing DNA on a small level. You had a slightly, mice might live, 4 years or so, maybe at most.
Yeah.
So you have this one mice, it was older, and this other mice, and it was younger. They use this sequence, and I'm not sure it has to do with telomeres or just the DNA sequence themselves, but they're repairing it, and now the older mice had physically no difference than the younger mice. So, I mean...
that's pretty phenomenal.
For science, I mean, we're just... and that's very exciting stuff.
Yeah.
And, what was it? We recently found that new solar system out. Has 7 planets or something, and 3 of them are in the Goldilocks zone. We just found that recently.
So what we're trying to say is we develop our knowledge, and in the process we also have to develop our way of living with the new knowledge in a moral and sensitive way toward each other.
Right.
And that's a constant. And so all cultures have to have, I don't want to say, whether you're a theist or a non-theist, a naturalist, you have to have faith and reason. What I mean by faith is just trust. We have to learn to trust each other. But I think you would agree, we try to make our trust rational, not blind faith.
Informed
faith, yeah. So that our faith can have some basis, so that we can trust. And just to walk down the street is an act of faith.
Right.
And you get married, that's an act of faith. Now here's a good example of faith and reason. When you get married, you don't want to just say, well, I feel like I love you. That's not enough.
Right.
You've got to have some evidence that this other person is trustworthy. And furthermore, it may be a trustworthy person, but you may not get along with a person as well as another person. And you have to figure out, and that takes time. And that's why it seems to me courtship ought to be more than just a year. Because you can't get to know another person in a year, just that much.
Well, right. I mean, in a lot of settings, it also depends on the time, I would think. For example, in the military, there's the concept of how, and this seems to be true along, of course, I was in, for a little while, I was in the Air Force, and something I seen common when talking to other veterans and different services, different lengths of time they were in, is this restlessness, in this sense, this bond that is formed in such a tight, compact amount of time, and then it's all over, relatively speaking.
I got you. Yeah.
It's essentially it's the bunker box. It's the pillbox.
Well, you have to have the bond in some ways just to survive.
Right.
When you're in battle, you have to have your comrades to trust. Otherwise, they're an enemy.
Right. I mean, and it's in those short amount of times that you'll develop this. Otherwise, people might think it's maybe not genuine, but you'll form quickly these bonds of trust with people, and part of it's out of necessity.
Necessity, yeah.
And then part of it is just because the range of emotions you go through, right? And I think cognitively, whenever we learn things, the more interactions, the more senses we're engaging in the process of learning something, the more we'll retain it. And I think that applies in the same way to bonds and relationships. If you're going through something, you can apply to psychology and trauma. Something crazy is going on in your life, and a very traumatic event, you'll remember every detail about it. And the same with bonds and battlefield forged bonds.
Yeah, they discovered, I remember during the Second World War, I'm old enough to remember some of the people coming back from the war, and some of them had a very hard time because of the memories and the shock they went through. I remember I had an uncle who had been with General Patton, and he went through a lot of horrendous battle. I mean, I remember while he would be asleep, and you could see him fighting, and really going through, and just really horrendous experiences after the war. Now, oddly enough, he was an incredibly gentle human being. Here he was a top sergeant,
right?
With General Patton's, but a very kind and gentle person. And I think that's why he might have been a good top sergeant. He could be very strict and know the regulations and the rules, and yet be understanding with his men.
There's a theory that goes along with. There's actually a TED talk about it, but in general, there's some good literature out there and well on it, and that goes to the type of personality. If someone's a giver, they're a taker, or if they're a mediator. And it seems that when you have an organization, this kind of a sidetrack, but if you have an organization, this applies to business, it applies to a community, anything. If you have a communication full of givers and mediators, you'll excel. But the takers, you have to watch out for them, because the ratio isn't the same. You can have, it seems to be like a 3-to-1 ratio. So one taker type personality can disrupt probably the effectiveness of 3 giver type personalities.
Yeah, I see your point, yeah.
And so you have to be careful for the takers, because if they'll weed themselves out just because of how they interact and how they'll expect other people, it'll be a very negative, non-reciprocal relationship. But if you have your mediators and your givers, the givers will just want to give. They live to give. The mediators will take that giving, and they'll also be able to give back, and it's a wonderful relationship. But
I watched my father develop. Now, that's funny that a kid can watch his father develop, but he worked in public service. He was in the restaurant business, had his own restaurant. Well, he had to be pleasant to his customers even when he wasn't feeling well. You know, you don't always feel upbeat, but your customers, you owe respect. Otherwise, you're not going to be in business.
Right.
And so he learned to be friendly. And so when I walked down the street with him in Knoxville here, people would stop and talk with him along the street. We couldn't go any long distance because so many people he had just worked with them. Customers would just stop and say hello to him and say a few words. So
real man about town.
And then it was a pleasant, and I realized, now here he was, a very tough Texan moving to Tennessee and learning how to live in another culture. And married to a mountain woman who was really as tough as he was,
right.
And watching them develop a good relationship, and lasting for many, many years until she died, and he died, of course. But it's a reciprocal thing. It's figuring out what you want. That's why I'm a hedonist, in the sense that respect the fact that you want pleasure out of life and happiness. And then, as you've been pointing out, you got to have rules and regulations to bring this about.
Right.
And other people have to have rules and regulations, because they want pleasure too.
Right. People often like to make this or promote this kind of veneer of, well, people can moderate themselves. We can just do what we want to do. We don't need rules. We don't need regulations. But once you strip that away, it comes down to that reality of, well, I think I'm just going to go this direction. Another person, I think I'm just going to go this direction. And unless you have something to stop them from running into each other, you'll be at an impasse.
Now, here we are using a language But a language has got
It's true.
grammar.
Yeah.
And otherwise, we don't communicate.
Yeah, we need understood, and of course, now, the French sometimes, I think, take it to, I'm going to say extremes, but they take it to another level. They have they have a council of regulating language, right? English and many other languages are more common use, right? They develop and change over usage. Whereas French, they actually have a council dedicated to regulating. Of course, you can't stop a language to be used how it's going to be used, but they take a special note on it to maintain.
That helps me to understand. When I was doing my PhD, I had to take 2 languages, and I thought, well, I took German, and because I'd had a year in college, and so I did some study on my own, passed the German. And then I thought, well, I've had a lot of Greek, I'll try Greek. Then I began, this Greek's awfully hard. So I said, well, I haven't had any French, but I'll just get a tutor to help me a little.
Yeah.
And I passed the French, enough to get through the program at least. And I thought, after I'd had 50 semester hours of Greek, I'm not sure I could have passed it still.
Yeah, très bien.
But I see your point. Some languages have a different kind of a flow in them and structure that. Yeah, it's facilitating.
Yeah, it's well, just kind of a quick thought here. Do you want to do a quick kind of a quick commercial break here, and then?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
All right. Okay, so in case you're just turning in, this is the Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville, Rationalists of East Tennessee. We're joined definitely by them and by individual contributions.
Okay, and this is a live show. I hope you can recognize. It is Tuesday from 5 to 5:55 Eastern Time here in Knoxville on the television CTV. And so tell your out-of-town friends and others to watch in, if you would.
Yep, and today's show is live on the 18th of April.
18th, yeah.
And you can call us on the number right there on the screen.
215-2288.
And we'll take your call gladly, and please enjoy these informative commercial breaks.
Okay.
You find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org. If you live in or around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun.
Okay. The Atheist Society of Knoxville has a meeting of 2 times a week. Fun, food, and conversation, and so forth. And then the Knoxville Atheist Society.org. That's KnoxvilleAtheist.org. The purpose of ASK is to supply information about the community and camaraderie and outreach and so forth. And starting January 31st is what? I've forgotten what it is. Something on Kingston Pike.
The Flats and Taps. That's where
Yeah,
that's where new location is.
Okay.
And once a month we do a Skeptics Book Club, and this is on the second Sunday of the month. The book we just had recently this month was Being Mortal, Medicine, and What Matters in the End by Deckel Edge. Really enjoyed it. And but it's at Books A Million on 8513 Kingston Pike.
Mm-hmm. Books A Million, yeah.
And it's at 2 o'clock every second Sunday of the month. And we just show up. It helps to have read the book. We'll have an update on the next show of what the book will be, but you don't have to have read it to show up and join the conversation.
Yeah, good conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get back to our topic now. Can the New Testament be read generously?
Yeah.
And fairly? And I'd like to point out is that one of the earliest writer in the New Testament is probably the Apostle Paul. I mean, that's debatable, but and the Gospels come later. And I'd like to emphasize, the Apostle Paul doesn't seem to know a lot about the historical Jesus. Now, we've mentioned this on the program, but I want to emphasize this. And because he is in heated dispute, apparently, with other believers. And sometimes the language is pretty strong, using words like hypocrites and agents of Satan and all of this. I mean, that's pretty strong language for religious people who are supposed to love their neighbor themselves.
Right.
So I'm suggesting that Paul invented, from my point of view, invented much of what's called Christian theology, that it didn't grow out of a historical Jesus. I think the historical Jesus was a Jew who had the traditional monotheism with the rules of don't steal and don't lie and love your neighbor as yourself and that sort of thing, and taught in parables and stories, and apparently got a reputation of kindness, and he had to live in a Roman government that sometimes could be reasonably cruel, at least from their point of view, because they were being conquered. Now, I offer this conjecture. There's enough in the New Testament that suggests to me, and to many biblical scholars now, that Jesus really thought that a supernatural intervention was about to take place in his lifetime. And that thy kingdom come, thy will be done, he was taking this literally. And he expected a good world to come in which the poor would have a better deal in life, because apparently a lot of the Galileans and his neighbors were not too wealthy, to say the least. And they were under bondage, and some of them. And so he was hoping for more freedom and a better life for people, and he thought it was to be a supernatural intervention, and he was called a Messiah. The word Messiah just comes from the old David tradition of the anointed one, and he would be the anointed one, or some of his disciples thought he would be, and he would be a leader. But I think that's about all there was to it. Then all of this Son of God supernaturalism thing that was added on in the Trinity came later, not with him, because and the notion even of the so-called Lord's Supper, this is my body, take and eat. I have the feeling that, and I think you can make a good case, that came mostly from the Greek tradition, and that the Hebrew notion of eating blood. And I mean, that's contrary to the Jewish religion.
Well, that's a good point, especially with the blood.
Yeah. Drinking blood. Yeah. So I don't think that Jesus was offering his body as protein.
Right.
So I think all that's pretty much mythology. To be sure, he had a good supper probably with his disciples and with other people. Apparently in the New Testament he did eat a lot because he got invited out. And he made friends, and so you get out invited out to eat. But to turn it into a Eucharist, and the Catholic tradition doing that is I don't know who it serves, but it doesn't serve the people too well.
Right. I think it goes along with basically maintaining an environment of what's the word? It's not conformity. You could say conformity, but more of community. You're forming rituals, you're making actions, you're designing rituals and
predictability in their rituals, you can
Right.
say that. And all cultures have certain rituals, even in football games. In the halftime, they have certain rituals. And rituals are okay if you start, however, making them some kind of supernatural intervention. And we've mentioned on the program before, Paul got so carried away. See, I don't think he knew anything about a historical Jesus. There's no any real strong evidence.
because it was written over 30 years after
Yeah.
that, because we started writing these things down.
Well, I just think he believed. He says he went to the third heaven, met Jesus there. And he got angry with the notion that he said, I did not get this from any man. Well, you would think common sense would, if you had 12 disciples there, he would learn from them. But you don't get a lot of evidence that this took place. And all of this Trinity stuff and all of that came, I think, after Jesus. It's not part of the Hebrew tradition.
Right, and which itself it's very polytheistic origins going back, right? Because you had different. Actually, Karen Armstrong, she writes a book
She's
called
good.
History of God. Yeah, it goes into a lot of, and it was essentially what I think gives what people like to give credence about the accounts of
Chalcedonian,
in the Bible was just because some things were stated to be so radically different that well, there's just no way someone would write this down unless it were true, which it falls into a categorical fallacy. But that aside, it was the notion that well, in before that time, right, in polytheistic society, if you were traveling in the land of over here, you worship that god. If you're traveling in the land of this, you worship that god. So it was a radical notion.
Well, the whole notion of no other gods before me
Right.
already presupposes polytheism.
Right.
And other nations got their gods. And the Canaanites had their gods.
Right. I mean, they all had
Baal.
the god of what is it, fertility and harvest or something like that. And you had Ashra.
Oh yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
And then you had and then of course you had this.
Asherah, yeah.
You had this notion. What made Yahweh, again, the defense for it stand out so much was that he would not reveal his name, and it was thought back in those times that if you have someone's full name, you could control them.
Control them, yeah.
And so this one Yahweh character wouldn't reveal his name, and he would only report to be presented to other people as, what was it? I am he.
I am that I am.
I am that I am. Right.
Yeah, that's all.
Right, and then so.
And you have later on Jesus reportedly taking this up for himself in the fourth gospel, and I think this is just pure myth.
But it does follow.
But that to me the Trinity notion is Christianity was trying to be monotheistic, but in a highly pluralistic Greek and Roman world, and so the Trinity is a kind of a weeding together and weaving together of polytheism and monotheism, and then you have various versions of the Trinity, like modalism. Modalism is, well, God's three modes rather than three persons.
And how have they heard that before? Yeah.
And so
in a while.
Even then, with Christianity, you had centuries of trying to work this out after they came up with it, trying to figure out, well, what version of it do they want to have?
And with go ahead.
Well, then you have the point of Jesus having two natures. Well, that's a big problem, because one of them is the divine nature, and the other is human nature. Well, those are two different things.
Right.
Either you're omnipotent or you're not. You can't have it both ways.
But it seems easy to make an argument for someone to say, well, of course the human nature wouldn't experience these powers and experience these sensations, but the divine nature would. And when you try to reconcile that, It just comes down to a matter of I don't know how to describe it. It's just saying what sounds nice with no foundation for it.
Yeah. Well, even the temptations of Jesus is trying to reinterpret the story of Adam and Eve. It's out there in the desert instead of the garden, and he's being tempted. Well, if he's omniscient, he already knows he's not going to be tempted. I mean, he's not going to give. I mean, if he is human, he wouldn't know.
Right.
But if he's God, and the tradition after Paul says he was, then he would already know he's not going to yield to temptation, so it's no big deal.
Right.
Now, what I'm seeing, there may be, if Jesus out there in the wilderness, struggling around with himself and having temptations, but he was fully human, not God.
Right. And you see those parallels between the Old Testament and the New Testament. A lot of themes that are just copied and told in different settings.
Restated again, yeah.
And an interesting thing with with Catholicism, right? Before you had the Reformation, and well, even now it continues to happen. Well, I'm sorry, not present day. For a long time after, it continued to happen. You see more elements of the monotheism portion because you'll see of saints, and saints represent the embodiment of luck or the embodiment of
fortune,
or the embodiment of there's so many of them.
Yeah.
And charity of whatever.
Yeah.
And those are essentially, they're kind of appeasements to try to take in the mass polytheism and to say, well, look, we have this too. Just come with us.
Now, the Protestant tradition is all believers are saints.
Right.
Yeah, but they did tend to promote those saints into kind of almost semi-divinities almost.
Right.
And just as you had the angels, I mean, you have in the Hebrew tradition, they are called the sons of God. Now, whether they're angels or not, what does it mean, sons of God? And one of them is called the adversary. And he goes around and causes trouble, but apparently they work for God.
Yeah.
Well, this is all trying to explain all the problems of life, given their system. And they try to, just as in physicists, they come up with a revision of the theory of atoms to try to make more sense. And that's what science does all the time, is make revisions, and that's what theology did. They made revisions, and sometimes you have competition between the two.
And that's where you get tens of thousands of denominations thinking different things.
Exactly.
Whereas
you got even among Baptists, you got American Baptists and Southern Baptists.
Yeah.
And the Southern Baptists divided a little over a decade ago.
Well, and something that comes to mind, well, it's getting quite close to close, was talking about science and similar strides, right? There's a song from Tim Minchin. It's a poem, Storm, and just one stanza from it says, "Science adjusts its views on what is based on what is observed. Faith is denial of observation so that belief can be preserved." So it seems to strive just different methods. It'd be nice if everyone could get on board. That's what my take on it.
Well, it's even in the theology, they had to develop some critical analysis, otherwise it wouldn't be ology.
Right.
And that's why you had so many denominations, and that's okay. It's good to have freedom so people can develop their own views, and then they can interchange, and then people can change or modify their views or change their alliances.